A big part of my career has been looking at the therapeutic value of the 12 steps because the 12 steps really have harnessed some powerful psychological forces that creates an amazing change in our life. What is that change? Well, the truth is that the 12 steps are engineered to help us achieve emotional sobriety, to achieve true independence of spirit, to achieve autonomy, to learn how to take care of ourselves. These are things that we don't know. Emotional sobriety really helps us learn how to have a healthy relationship, how to have union with the preservation of our integrity, how to cooperate with integrity. Most of us get lost in our relationships. Most of us do a lot of things we don't want to do. We don't really know how to show up in a good way. Emotional sobriety is about learning to have healthy relationships. What we're going to be doing tonight is we're going to be looking at this chapter that I've written in my book, 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety, on perfectionism, right? Breaking the bonds of perfectionism. Well, as you're going to see, in order for us to find that balance and maturity in our life, that breaking the bonds of perfectionism becomes such an important part of our emotional sobriety. And so tonight I'm going to start off this discussion of this chapter by asking you a question. Have you ever wondered what makes you think in such a black and white way? What makes you think in terms of absolutes in your life? Now, people like Albert Ellis, who was the founder of rational emotive therapy, called that kind of thinking irrational thinking. But I want to explore what goes into or what experiences create an absolute approach to life and that we then cling on to as though that's somehow a solution. So to do that, we got to go back. We got to go back to what Dr. Karen Horney called the basic anxiety. And she described it, our basic anxiety is the anxiety that we have that we're not going to be loved, that we're not going to be accepted, and that we're not going to belong. And it's such a critical part of our experience to feel those things because those things will make us feel safe. And it's hard to grow and develop when you don't feel safe. Because when you don't feel safe, then you're going to have to take a lot of emergency measures to create safety. And all of those are going to compromise our development in one way or another. Now, I've been around this planet for 72 years now, and I have not met one person that feels that good about themselves that they feel that they're going to be loved and accepted and belong all the time. And I think it's a wound that we all share, and it's a desire that we all have. And so when we talk about it, and a lot of people say when they go to their first AA meeting or Al-Anon meeting, they feel home because it's the first time in their life where they start to feel that they're accepted the way they are. Well, what makes that so important is that experience of being accepted as we are. Well, the fact is that it's so important because none of us really feel that in our life. So let me talk about that. You see, when that anxiety starts, what we're going to do is we're going to search for a solution to be able to bind the anxiety, to resolve the anxiety. And to resolve the anxiety, we have to come up with some kind of a solution that's going to ensure our being loved, our being accepted, and our belonging. Now, what could that look like? Well, what we search for is what Dr. Karen Horney called, in fact, she called the search for this, the search for glory. that if I can find out the right formula in terms of who I should be, that's going to make me okay, it's like hallelujah. It's discovering glory in our life. Now I've got the answer, right? It's like the Holy Grail. It's finally in my hands here. This is gonna be the answer to my life. That answer she described as the idealized self-image. It's the self, if I become that, which will guarantee that I'm going to be loved, accepted, and belong. Now, it's a big lie because there's no guarantee, right? But we have to resolve this anxiety. And so we resolve this anxiety by adopting this concept of who we must become to be okay. So now, instead of actualizing who we really are, all of our energy goes into actualizing a concept of who we should be. The who we should be is created in absolute terms. You're either good or you're bad. You're either okay or not okay. You're either doing the right thing or the wrong thing. You're either loved or you're hated. At that point in time, our world becomes a world of absolutes. And these absolutes are further reinforced, I guess we could say, by developing a whole construct of shoulds on how we should be. Dr. Karen Horney says that at some point our life becomes tyrannized by these shoulds. They end up taking over our life. I'm going to read you a few quotes of hers because I think that they're so powerful and they really help us understand what is happening here for us. She goes, this perfectionism that we develop, so let's tie this together now. So those absolutes create those perfectionist specifications that Bill talked about in his letter. I failed to mention that a minute ago, and I want to do that because that ties into what I'm going to say. So those perfectionistic specifications are coming out of these absolutes we have. So I must look like this. I must be like this if I'm going to be okay. She says the perfectionism is a result of the authoritative control of the idealized image. The idealized image takes over complete control of our lives. At that point in time, we lose becoming the determining force in our lives. As soon as the idealized image has that authoritative control over our lives, we are no longer the determining force in our lives. Our life is now going to be determined and controlled by the ideas or the concepts and constructs of that idealized image. And those are manifested in terms of the kind of shoulds that we have about how we're supposed to behave. I should be like this. I should be like that. You should be this way. Now, that's the other insight that she has, is that when I put those perfectionistic specifications on me, I don't just put them on me. I'm also going to demand that you function that way. So not only do my shoulds operate in terms of how I'm supposed to be, but they also demand how you're supposed to act. That's where all of these expectations we're talking about come from in these unenforceable rules. They're a projection of this authoritative control of the idealized image. This tyranny of the shoulds creates an inner coercion meaning that it forces me to adhere to these principles. It creates an inner pressure that is directed both jointly at myself and other people to live up to these standards. So what happens is that as we now, right, commit ourselves to developing a concept of who we should be, our personalities become cramped. In other words, we lose flexibility. Our behavior now becomes quite stereotyped because of the demands of the idealized image that we've accepted as the goal for our life. So we're no longer trying to become who we are and what we can be. We're trying to live up to an image of what we should be. This is why so many of us have that imposter syndrome. We're afraid we're going to be found out. Because when you pull back the curtain, we're not our idealized image at all. You've heard me talk about self-hate before, and that's where it comes from, you see, because if you're anything other than what you should be, you're going to hate yourself, to try to punish yourself to get back in line with the standards and the authoritative control of that idealized image. Albert Ellis, the founder of rational emotive therapy, he says this, he says, wanting to be perfect is not going to create the problems that feeling that you must be perfect to be okay. So when perfection becomes an absolute, that this is what I must be and who I must be, now we're in trouble. And it creates all kinds of difficulties in our lives. Because what it happens is you've heard me talk about this before, but I think it's worth it just, elaborating on today, is how self-alienation plays into all of this. So now, because I am now under the authoritative control of this idealized image, that any aspect of who I am that is not congruent, does not fit with who I'm supposed to be, is going to be disconfirmed. I'm going to have to cut off my awareness of those things so that I can feel okay. So the more demands I have of who I'm supposed to be, the less awareness I'm going to have in terms of how I function. Another way of saying this is the more demands I have of myself, the less aware of myself am I going to be, because I don't dare risk seeing things that aren't going to fit with how I'm supposed to be. And if I do see those things, I'm going to hate myself for them. But the first line of defense is to avoid them, not look at them. This is why the waking up process is so important in emotional sobriety, because what we start waking up to is that we are the determined ones rather than being the determining ones, that we are being controlled by these forces that have been outside of our awareness. Like I said, the authoritative control of the idealized image. We realize that that's been running our life. And as we wake up to that, we start to deconstruct our dependence on this idea of who we're supposed to be. And you see, that's ultimately the big lie that's underneath all of these problems, is that I have to be someone other than I am to be okay. So we build a foundation in our life that's based on rejecting ourselves in order to become something we're not. Well, what a dilemma. What a problem that this creates. It's a serious problem. I have seen more people in recovery suicide because of that authoritative control of that idealized image, especially when that person realizes that they're not being who they should be. And if they can't let go of the idea that that's hokey, that whole thing is on the wrong premise, they can't challenge that idea and start to deconstruct it. I have seen many people take their lives because they give up the hope that their life could be okay. Meaning, I'm not going to be perfect, so why bother? That's how strong this perfectionism drives us. Now, you may have a sense of your perfectionism is when you make a mistake. So think about that. How do you respond when you make a mistake? What's the feeling you have? If you're ashamed of yourself, if you are humiliated by the fact that you've made a mistake, boy, that indicates that your perfectionism is incredibly strong. This is what makes step 10 so important. Continue to take personal inventory, and when we're wrong, promptly admitted it. Because it's continuing to say, no, you don't have to be perfect to be okay. You have to be who you are to be okay. You have to be authentic to be okay. And that 10th step is an ongoing reminder of that. Is that when I just admit that, yeah, I've made a mistake here. That's fine. I'm not perfect. You know, I like that bumper sticker that says, please be patient with me. God isn't finished with me yet. We should all carry a sign under construction. I mean, beware under construction. For some people, that might mean you have to wear a hard hat around them. So that's what this chapter is about, is breaking the bonds of our perfectionism. That becomes so important if we're going to be able to enjoy emotional sobriety and establish it. So I think that's enough by way of an introduction in this topic. Let me invite Roger in, and I know Thom is here. Thom Potash, have you seen Herb Kagan? Is he with us tonight?
Yeah, I did see her. I'm going to bring him in.
Great. Wonderful. I thought Herb would be with us tonight, which is great. There he is.
Hello.
All right, gentlemen. I expect a perfect response to my introduction to this chapter tonight.
I expect that you're going to be disappointed.
Was this your card? Was this your card, Alan?
That was my card.
All
How
right,
did you
good.
know that? How did you know that? Was the
I'm
4
good.
club? 4 is actually my favorite number, by the way.
There you go. I know that. Of course I know it.
All right, who wants to take a first shot at starting the discussion on this?
I'll do it because I'll do it quickly. I really will. This is at the core of every damn thing we're dealing with. I mean, it's in one form or another. It's amazing to me, depending on what words we put to it. You know, I tend to talk about my should monster. Some people talk about perfectionism. Some, people have different metaphors, but it's really all the same thing. It's this thing like that Alan's describing, in which what we learn. What we learn is to hand our authority away, and sometimes it's to specific people, sometimes it's particular people in our lives, but ultimately it's this codependent relationship within ourselves, it's an intrapersonal codependency relationship where we turn it over to the perfectionist or the should monster. And the thing I want to point out the obvious. It's a system that's designed, and Alan said it. It's a system that's designed for you to guarantee to be personally rejected. You know, it's a system that was designed for you to fail. It's not the tough, loving coach that's trying to get, you know, I'm being hard on you for a reason. It's like, no, because they keep moving the bar, they keep moving they change it. If you made a B, you should have made an A. If you made an A, you should have made an A plus. If you made an A plus, you should have made it sooner, you know, or they should have come up with a new grade for you or something like that. And it's like it will never let you succeed. Or the thing I do, I'll show you my PowerPoint presentation of that, is I always ask if people can, if this makes sense to them. This is my expectation as a perfectionist, and here's my level of competence. Here I am working at trying to meet my expectation. It works like this.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's like you're never going to get there. You're never going to get there. And it is what. And the other thing I want to say is, and I'm glad we're going to spend some time on this chapter, because it is at the core of most of this stuff, I think. And it's some of the hardest work you'll ever do to learn how to and put it into practice, how to let it go. And you know, and I don't know that I'm not here to claim that I've mastered it and gotten all the way through it, but it's hard work. So I hope one of the things we can all do together while we go through this chapter is commiserate with each other and support each other by being post-it notes for each other, reminding each other that we, you know, nobody's going to do anything perfect, including get over perfectionism. Amen.
Amen.
I'd like to make some comments. Thank you. Good to be here. Thank you for your patience with me in my coming and going. It's probably become, I'm aware that it's been there all the time, but I'm becoming more and more aware of it in the workshops that I do. Over the last 5 years, I think my awareness began to be, and maybe some of the work that Alan and I are doing on emotional sobriety, I think, is having its way with me in terms of improving my own consciousness of other people's consciousness or lack thereof. And that is in the workshops, about 50% of the people, and it's really helped me, about 50% of the people are driven by this perfectionism, whether they know it or not. But most of them kind of know it and suspect it. But a lot of them don't even know that that's the standard. And in a way, I a little disagreement with Thom. I don't think the should is even in the, it's a kissing cousin, but it's not in the relationship of real perfectionism. That's I don't know what I'm talking about here scientifically, but it seems like that's a neurosis, a neurotic handicap of trauma of some kind, and you all are equipped to explain how that has developed, but not everybody has that perfectionism. At least this is my observation from watching people do the work of this. And I've come to, first of all, I see it as kind of like, as Alan described it, as this survival instinct in us. But the real question is why somebody has it and somebody doesn't. Why the majority of people, I think, at least 50%, don't have it. They don't have that drive for, oh, they have lots of shoulds, the stuff we talk about in emotional sobriety, that lack of anchor within themselves, but they're not driven, and they don't feel guilty or shame about not living up to their own or somebody else's expectations, in the same way that I believe that the chapter, I haven't read the chapter yet, but the chapter probably implies. And it's like part of our survival instinct of, Alan mentioned it, safety and satisfaction and social needs that are, in fact, I mean, millions of years of conditioning of being in the community or being in a relationship. In the Catholic tradition, one of the worst things that you could have is be excommunicated. Or one of the worst things you could have in early medieval culture was to be I forget the word, when you're thrown out and you're thrown out of the village and you're on your own, banished.
Mhm.
That's a death sentence. That's a death sentence. So it's a deep survival thing. Alan talked about absolutes. You know, the Oxford group had 4 absolutes, and Bill wouldn't include them because he knew that alcoholics would just totally have a reaction to anything that was suggested as an absolute. And so he makes a huge point, and I think the antidote to perfectionism and the antidote to the absolute is what Bill stresses as humility.
Mhm.
And humility meaning, in the simplest of terms, a truthful relationship with reality, an objective relationship with reality. I've got lots of gifts, I've got lots of mischief in me, and my job is to balance the gifts and balance the mischief to try to become as conscious and best human being that I can become. At least that's my awareness of it. And Bill saw it at the end of the 12 steps on page 60. He saw it. He laid out these principles, 12 of them. And on page 60, he lists the step 12, and then he says, I'll paraphrase, progress, not perfection. We're not saints. Relax. And so what I've done in my groups right up front is I'm saying, do the best you can, knowing it's not the best you can, accepting it's not the best you can, even though you want to do the best you can. And that's good enough. It's literally good enough. And you will do better perhaps next time or next year or tomorrow. But for right now, whatever you're doing, thinking, and feeling, even though you absolutely know it's not good enough, it actually is. It's good enough for right now. And the number of people that have almost visibly exhaled
Mhm.
and or have commented on how that drops such a pressure to show up, to do the work, to speak accurately, to be seemingly knowledgeable. It's just really relaxed the group. Anyway, that's where I'm at in that.
Yeah, great comments.
Yeah.
Yep.
Great comments. Raj.
Yeah. An experience comes to mind for me that I had with my son when he was somewhere between 2.5 or 3. A year or 2 years ago, we were watching some videos of when he was a little guy. He's 27 now, but and he was playing with his beloved Thomas the Tank Engine train set, where he had the big wooden board and laid out the train set on it, and it wasn't, battery operated or electronic. It was all hand pushed and so on. And he just had a blast for like a year and a half or 2 years. Just, we kept buying new pieces and new equipment, like little sheds and bridges. And it was just an amazing process of creativity. He loved real trains and construction equipment and stuff like that too. But so he was playing with it one day, and I was videotaping. And there was a little log loader and unloader. It was one of the cars on his train set, and there were like 3 or 4 little logs, and you pull it up to this little platform, and you press this lever, and the logs come off onto the platform. And I'm just enjoying watching him play. And he brought the log loader around. He hit the lever, but it wasn't quite lined up just right. So the logs turned kind of sideways as they went. And I thought perfectly innocently, I said, you didn't line it up quite right, huh, Nick? And he looked at me. He said, Dad, I'm only 2 years old. Dad, I'm only, it was with a much more exasperated expression. Dad, I'm only 2 years old. It's like, and I went like, oh my God. Because I mean,
You didn't line it up right, did you, Roger?
I didn't line it up right, but it was such
That's
a
good,
wonderful
Tom.
talk about being taught by our kids, right? It's like, I
Wow.
didn't think there was anything negative at all in the way that I said that or perfectionistic. Boy, was I wrong. His reaction showed me in a heartbeat. And that's just one of many experiences. The good thing that came out of that and other experiences, which was already in force even then, was I taught him, look at that, there it is, the ego again. You know, he learned for himself, and his mother and I contributed to that. We helped with that, to speak up when he felt judged in that way, when he felt criticized in that way. And he got real good at that very quickly, particularly with me, because I had much more perfectionism in me than I was aware of, which is no surprise. It was practically explicitly demonstrated in the household that I grew up in. But here's another point I want to mention about this. This is not black and white, not simple stuff. Alan, you mentioned it in your chapter, that how does our natural desire for wholeness and our natural desire for mastery, I believe you put it, get hijacked by our perfectionistic concepts and ideas. And that's where it's really tricky. As a parent, how do you help teach your child, but not criticize or lead them to feel criticized and judged? How do you help, guide at certain points, but not do anything that's hurtful or damaging? Those things are really, really tough moments and tough decisions to make those choices in the real world, I think, just as it is for us as adults. I've often heard Alan say that, our perfectionism in and of itself is not a bad thing, to want to do things really well. But as Eckhart Tolle said about, the mind being a wonderful servant, but a terrible master when we're controlled by our obsessions and our racing thoughts and, all of that stuff. Well, it's the same with our perfectionism. It can serve us in some ways to be the best we're able to be in that moment, as you so eloquently said, and that needs to be good enough. But it's when it's our master, our top dog, as Alan talks about it in this chapter. That's when we get into all the trouble. Some of the most challenging work I've had to do for myself and with so many of my clients over the decades is where there are two parts to who they are. There's the incredibly perfectionistic, idealized self that Alan talked about. And then there's all the wreckage of that on the other side, the shame, the humiliation, the depression, the despair, the rage and frustration and anger, the fear of failure that prevents us from trying anything because we're afraid we might not make it perfectly. And it can be incredibly hard. And some clients I've worked with really do move back and forth between maybe being very successful in their work and so on, and driven and motivated and getting lots of kudos, but in their inner life or in their relationship life at home with their spouse or with their kids, they don't have a clue, or they're just not only lost, but as I say, filled with frustration or depression or despair, and swing back and forth between those two aspects of themselves in their life or in our lives, because I certainly do that as well, without being able to find a way to bring together those parts. I've talked about the idea of a bigger container that one of my Buddhist teachers I like to read talks about, where those are both parts of who we are, but we are somehow a big enough container to have both of those parts within us, but not slip into the trap that we all slip into of fully identifying in a given moment with either the perfectionist or the part that's despairing or hopeless or anxiety filled. In terms of self-esteem, it's pretty evident the effect that perfectionism can have on our self-esteem, because it's based on our, alignment with this idealized self and these idealized images and beliefs about who we need to be okay. it wreaks terrible damage on our self-acceptance as an important part of self-esteem. In fact, perfectionism is predicated on a rejection of self-acceptance, the rejection of ourselves as we are. It wrecks or wreaks both horrible damage on our sense of self-confidence, another key piece of self-esteem, on our level of self-respect when we're filled with shame and regret and remorse and self-judgment, another key piece of self-esteem. There's just so much alignment between all the ways that perfectionism damages our emotional sobriety, as we've talked about before. Every one of those things, to an extent, can be said, those are also the same ways it damages our sense of self-worth, our sense of being okay, as you just said, Herb, as we are in this moment. It's such a hard place to get to. Some moments I'm there in my life, most moments I'm not. That I really am both in this moment, given everything that's going on, especially if I'm in the grips of intense emotions, I really am doing the best that I can do in this moment, even if I look back on it with horror, right, at what I did or what I said, which I certainly do in my life at times. But it's such an important concept to grasp. In each moment, if we can really remember the full context of that moment, we really are doing the best that we're able to do. And if it's pretty poor, then I have to count on people around me, as my son showed me that day, okay, to help me, to protect themselves and to stand up for themselves, which again is incredibly hard for us to do at any given moment. So thank you guys, for your comments about it. Those are some of my thoughts about perfectionism and self-acceptance. Yeah.
Thanks, Raj. Let's have Thom come in the room and share any thoughts you have, Thom, and then open for maybe a few shares from the group.
Yeah, sounds good. I love this chapter, and the ideas behind it, especially around the false self and what it sets us up for later on. And I'd like to, in one of our weeks here, is to do a little piece on how much Don Miguel Ruiz talks about it in the domestication part of the Four Agreements. He follows right on track with what you've been talking about. So I'll set that aside for right now. Herb talked about the steps and the absolutes that sometimes come with AA. And what I thought when I first saw the 12 steps without having an interpreter, right, or a guide, was, what an order. I can't go through with it. It's like, this is too much, right? All of the 12 steps, all at once up on the wall, and the words, all, entirely, all, it's just. And what I didn't realize until I had some time and some instruction and some exposure was, if Bill had written like Thom, I'm going to use Tom's diagram with the hands. Bill wrote for aspirational, right? Knowing that, it was a goal that we can continually strive for, knowing we're not going to make it. But because if he had written, I was sort of ready to have God remove 50% of my defects of character, like I'd shoot for 47%, right? I would, even if he lowered the bar, I'd still be, until I got enough of the juice, and the results and the spirit that the 12 steps brought about, and the freedom and from self, and then I started like, oh, well, maybe I could try a little bit harder, maybe I could do a little better. And that kind of, Al talked about the 10th step. What a relief to have the 10th step, to just be able to course correct and not carry that, burden of having to be perfect, because then I could, make amends when I fall short, and, you know, and get some acceptance rolled into that about, you know, that I'm never going to be perfect, not as a cop out, but as a, you know, just as a tool for, a tool for finding my right place, my, you know, acceptance of the, you know, how I show up in the world, and you know, the acceptance of reality as it presents itself. You know, these tools are just make my life easier. I'll tell you that.
Does someone need to believe in God to successfully overcome addiction? Well, the way I like to think about what the program does, it connects us to who we really are. And what does that mean? Well, there's this incredible force in you and I, this growth force. It's the force that moved us from crawling to walking. You wanted to take those first steps. And when you fell, and you fell a lot of times, you didn't let your failures stop you. You picked yourself up, you learned from it. And how many times did you fail before you walked? You failed as many times as you needed to. You see that force, I call it a biological imperative, a psychological imperative, a spiritual imperative. It's moving you towards wholeness. It's moving you to be what you can be. Just like in the acorn is all the information it needs to become an oak tree. In you is all the information you need to become you. Become a you that can cope with life and to deal with whatever you need to deal with to be okay. And that's what I'll talk about in my new book, The 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety.